Hello everybody, this is Naya from DoSpace, and this is an intro to Linux. This will be a PowerPoint presentation, and you can find this on our website. It will also be available for download. So let's get started. Now you're asking yourself, what exactly is Unix? I meant to say Unix. Now Unix is an operating system which was developed in the 1960s, and this has been in constant development ever since. By operating systems, we mean the suites of programs which makes the computer work. It is a stable multi-user task service SaaS system for services and desktops. Unix systems also have a graphical interface, or the GUI, user interface. It's similar to Microsoft Windows, which provides an easy environment to use. However, the knowledge of Unix is required for operations which aren't covered by a graphical program, or for when there is no Windows interface available, for example, in a telnet session. Now, what is the primary difference between Unix and Linux? As you can obviously hear, I got the two mixed up. So what are the differences? Now the features of Unix is it is multi-user, and it's also multitasking, so you can do anything and everything on it. It can be used as the master control program in workstations and servers, which is good for your workspace or wherever you're working. Hundreds of commercial applications are available, and in its heydays, it was primarily adopted and became the standard in universities, if anybody is old enough to remember that far. Now, the features of the Linux, it supports multitasking. The programs consist of one or more processes, and each process have one or more threads. But the good thing is it can easily coexist with other operating systems, so if you're using Mac or Windows and you want to install Linux, that'd be fine. You can also install it as a virtual machine through using VirtualBox or Parallels. Individual accounts are protected because of appropriate authorization. And basically, Linux is a replica of Unix, but it just doesn't use its code. So far, that's some of the primary differences of Unix and Linux. And now, here on this chart, we will go into the meat of it. Now, as you can see here, what is the cost? For Linux, it is freely distributed. It's downloaded through magazines, books, webs, etc. And there are also paid versions also available for Linux. For Unix, it's different flavors of Unix that have different pricing depending on the type of vendor, since Unix, of course, is more complex. For development, Linux is open source, and thousands of programs collaborate online and contribute to its development, whereas Unix has different systems and different versions. Now, and these versions are primarily developed by AT&T as well as other commercial vendors. Now, who exactly can use Linux? Everyone can use Linux, from just everybody can basically use Linux. If you have a computer, you can use Linux. Whereas Unix, it is primarily used in internet servers, workstations, and PCs. Now, the text-made interface. For Linux, it is Bash, and it's the default shell. It offers support for multiple command interpreters, whereas Unix originally made to work in the Bourne shell, not Jason Bourne. However, it is now compatible with many other softwares. Going over here, the GUI. Linux has two GUIs, Viz, KDE, and GNOME, which is the most recognizable one, though there are many other alternatives, such as Mate, LXDE, XFCE, etc. Whereas Unix, their common development environment it's a common development environment, and it also has GNOME. Now, viruses. So far, Linux, as of the recording of this, it has about 60 to 100 viruses listed to date, which are currently not spreading, which is good. Whereas Linux, there are between 80 to 120 viruses reported to date in Unix. Now, for user threat detection and solutions are very fast because Linux is mainly community driven. So if there's any type of threat, or if from a user, the team of qualified developers, they would get on it. They would try to resolve the issue as best as they can. They would resolve the threat. Whereas Unix users, it would require a longer wait, and this is to get the proper bug fixing patch. So it's going to take a little longer. Now, architectures. Unix was initially developed for Intel's x86 hardware processors. And this is available for over 20 types of CPU, which also includes an ARM. Whereas Unix, it is available on a PA, RICS, and other interim machines. Yeah, I don't know what those words mean either. This is new to me too, so we'll be confused together. Now for usage. Linux can be installed on various devices like mobile phones, tablets, computers. Like I said, if you want to install Linux, you can use either Apple you can either use your Mac or your PC to do that. If you want to keep your current OS, but you want to install Linux, I would recommend using a virtual system. Like, for example, VirtualBox, which is free, or using Parallels, which you have to pay for, but it is stable. And however, if you do find yourself wanting to make your system exclusively a Linux system, the best thing to do is before you do that, back up everything, follow the instructions, and you can do that. Also, you can do a double boot. You can do a boot duo as well. As for Linux, the operating system is primarily used for internet servers, workstations, and PCs because it is so complex, and this is what it was made for, essentially. The best features of Linux is you can do a kernel update without rebooting, whereas Unix, more complicated, you have to do a FETA ZFS. It's a next generation file system, dtrace, which is a dynamic kernel tracing. Now the versions. Now there are different versions of Unix, and the current one, and they are Red Hat, Ubuntu, which is what I'm using right now, OpenSUSE, and etc. Where there are different versions of Unix, they are HPUX, AIS, BSD, etc. Now the file types. Unix supports file types like XFS and FS, CRAM, FSM, X1 to X4, UFS, dev points, and of course the popular one for Windows, NTFS. And whereas Unix is different, it supports file types of ZFS, HFX, GPS, XFS, VXFS. I know, it's a mouthful, I know. And finally, for portability, for Linux, of course, it's bootable. You can boot it on a USB stick. And also you can do an external hard drive, whichever you feel comfortable with. Whereas Unix, obviously, since it's used for the internet and workstations, is not portable. And for its source code, the source code is available to the general public, whereas Unix, it's not available to the general public. So, next we'll be talking about the limitations of Linux. as of this, there is no standard edition of Linux. Unlike Windows and Mac, they would have their own standard editions. Windows doesn't have that. Linux has patchier support drivers, which may result in misfunctioning of the entire system. So if you wanted to do Linux, completely do a Linux system on your PC or Mac, I would highly recommend backing it up first and following the instructions really well, because you never know. And this is an obvious one. Linux is, for new users at least, not as easy as use as Windows. And I'm hoping that the intro to Linux videos helped kind of ease that transition. But yeah, it's a completely different system. If you really want to dive into it, you have to realize that this is completely different. Many of the programs that we normally use from Windows, it will only run on Linux with the help of a complicated emulator, for example, Microsoft Office. So like I said before, if you really want to do this, back up your system, follow the instructions really well. And Linux is best suited for corporate users. It's much harder to introduce at home. If you're starting out on a computer, or a loved one is starting on a computer, I wouldn't do Linux, because they would not want to use a computer and probably think that you are crazy for giving this to them. Okay, so now the limitations of Unix. It is unfriendly, terse, inconsistent, and non-numerical user interface. And for the most part, the OS is designed for a slow computer, so you can't exactly expect fast performance, which is obvious because it is basically a system used for internet workstations and servers. Everybody's using it, and it can only do so much at a time. Now, the self interface can be treacherous because a typing mistake can destroy the files, and so I wouldn't want to be that. I wouldn't want to do that. I would be extremely nervous. The versions on the various machines are slightly different, so it lacks consistency, meaning that one version can work on a machine, but another version won't. So there's that. And Unix does not support any assured hardware interruption response times, so it doesn't support real-time response systems. And now this is the Linux market share compared to other OSs. So as you can see, the blue is Windows, which is the head market. The dark blue or black is Mac OS, which is in a respectable second. Linux, what we are talking about, well, it's actually in fourth, because the unknowns, which is the greens, are in third, and the Chrome OS is in fifth place. Now, these would have changed over time with the current updates in technology, and basically how the Chromebooks are becoming more accessible and available to everybody. So this could change over time. We'll have to wait and see. And finally, the key difference. The key difference is, to take away from this, the Unix source code is available to the general public, whereas Unix is a source code. Its source code is proprietary, which makes sense, because honestly, would you really want the source code for Unix to be available? No, that would be a disaster. The Unix OS, it was created in the 1960s at AT&T Bell Labs, where Linux is an operating system, whereas the Linux is an operating system built by Linus Torvalds at the University of Helsinki in 1991. Linux is essentially a clone of Unix. The Linux default shell is Bash, where the Unix shell is Bourne shell. Linux can detect threats and come up with solutions very, very fast, while Unix users have to wait longer amounts of time to get the proper patch for the bug. Again, since I described it works like the internet and different stations is more complex, this is expected. And finally, the important versions of Linux are Red Hat, Ubuntu, OpenSUSE, Solaris, whereas important versions of Unix are HP, AIS, BSD, etc. So that is our intro to Unix. I'm sorry I kept misspelling everything. I hoped that this was very informative for you. Over here are the resources that I have used to look up this information, which will be available. And what I want to take away from this is that it's really interesting to use, just as long as you understand what you're getting into, basically. Because unlike Chrome, Mac, and Windows, this is like a whole different new system. So if you really want to learn Unix and what exactly it's all about, my recommendation is to go to the Intro to Linux videos and sources, because that would be a good place to start, and because Linux is essentially a clone of Unix.